The forgotten meeting between blue wizards and Gandalf, LOTR lore. What if the victory at Mount Doom was only possible because two wizards you have never heard of spent 3,000 years alone in enemy territory, doing work that no song remembers? That is not a what-if pulled from fan imagination. That is what the lore actually says when you follow it all the way down. Unfinished Tales, Letter 211, a handful of late manuscripts. A creator who admitted, with a candor that should startle anyone paying attention, that he himself was not certain whether the agents he sent into the East succeeded in their mission, or became something he could barely bring himself to name. Most people who love this world know the five wizards the way you know the names of distant cousins. Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and then two more, blue ones, east somewhere. Doesn't matter. The movies confirmed it. 5 wizards, only 3 worth naming. But here is what that silence is actually covering. The blue wizards did not arrive in Middle-earth in the Third Age, alongside Gandalf and Saruman. They arrived in the Second Age, during the height of Sauron's dominion, while Numenor still stood, while the rings of power were being forged or already worn. They were inserted into the most dangerous theater of the most dangerous war in the history of the world, given a mission that required them to operate inside Sauron's sphere of influence for potentially 3,000 years, and then the record goes quiet. And the question that has haunted the margins of Tolkien's legendarium ever since, the one he floated and then never answered, is this: did they survive what they were sent into? Not physically, spiritually. Did they remain themselves? We are going to find out what the lore actually says, all of it. And by the end of this, the War of the Ring is going to look different to you than it ever has before. Here is where we start, the very beginning. Not the Third Age, not the Grey Havens, earlier than that. Tolkien, in the Astari chapter of Unfinished Tales, describes the arrival of the 5 wizards. He names them, he assigns them roles, and buried in that passage, given almost as an aside, is a detail that reshapes the entire timeline of Tolkien's world if you actually sit with it. The blue wizards, Alatar and Palando in their first naming, Morinitar and Romistamo in a later manuscript that we will return to in detail, did not sail from Valinor in the Third Age with the others. They came earlier. Tolkien is explicit about this in the later texts. Their arrival belongs to the Second Age, the age of Sauron's greatest ascent, the age of the Gift of Rings, the age when the men of the East were being shaped into instruments of a will they could not even fully perceive. Think about what that means for a moment. When Gandalf arrived at the Grey Havens and received Narya from Círdan, who told him with prophetic clarity that he would need it most of all, the blue wizards had already been in the field for potentially 1,000 years, maybe more. The exact dating in the secondary sources is uncertain, and Tolkien himself shifted it across drafts, but the directional truth is unambiguous. By the time Gandalf was setting his first foot on the shores of Middle-earth, Alatar and Palando were already deep inside a world Sauron had been building for centuries. And now pay attention to this next part, because this is the detail that almost nobody stops to examine. Tolkien, in that same passage, gives the blue wizards their reason for going east. They did not wander there. They were not assigned the east because nobody else wanted it, or because the Valar were filling out a roster. The text is clear that their mission was specific and deliberate. They were to go into the east, into the regions where Sauron's hold over mortal men was deepest, and weaken it, disrupt it, pull at the threads of loyalty and fear, and theological corruption that Sauron had been weaving into the cultures of the Eastern peoples since before the wizards existed as a program at all. This was a counterintelligence mission, not preaching, not wandering, not inspiring hope in a general sense, though that was part of Gandalf's Western mandate. The blue wizards were going behind enemy lines. And then Letter 211 confirms it, with a directness that should shake anyone who has thought of these two as narrative filler. Tolkien writes, and I want to sit with these exact words for a moment, that the blue wizards had had a very great influence on the history of the Second and Third Ages, in weakening and disorganizing the forces of the East. He uses the word great. He uses the word disorganizing. These are not the words of a man describing passive wanderers. These are the words of a man describing agents who did consequential, strategic, world-altering work. And then, in the same letter, almost in the same breath, he admits that he feared they may have done something else, that they may have had something to do with the beginnings of magical cults and secret religions. 2 sentences, both true simultaneously, both devastating in different directions. Because what Tolkien is describing in that pair of sentences is not a simple success or failure. He is describing the specific kind of corruption that only comes from proximity, from years inside enemy-shaped territory, from trying to resist a theology by understanding it well enough to dismantle it, and discovering, somewhere in the 3rd century or the 5th century or the 10th, that understanding and inhabiting are not always easy to separate. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to the names, because the names are a door that almost nobody opens. In the earliest texts, Tolkien called them LOTR and Palando. These are Quenya names, appropriate for Maiar who came from Valinor, but they are relatively neutral, descriptive without being urgent. Then, in late manuscripts that appear in the collection that became Unfinished Tales, Tolkien assigns them alternative names, Morinitar, Romestamo, and these names, when you translate them from Quenya, stop being neutral immediately. Morinitar means Darkness Slayer. Romestamo means East Helper. Now step back from the poetry for just a second and feel the weight of those names in their context. Tolkien gave his major figures names that expressed their essential nature, their function, their mission in the world. Olorin, Gandalf's Valinorian name, means something like dreamer or vision, connected to the Elvish word for thought and the quality of illuminating insight. Curanir, Saruman's Quenya name, means man of craft or man of skill. The names are not decorations, they are definitions. Morinitar, Darkness Slayer. This is not a name you give to an observer. This is not a name you give to a passive presence in a distant territory. This is a name you give to a Maiar who is going into the East specifically to kill something, not with a sword, but with the slow, patient, dangerous work of dismantling the darkness Sauron had built inside human civilization itself. Romestamo, East Helper. And maybe that second name is even more revealing, in a quieter way. Not East Fighter, not East Conqueror, East Helper. A name that suggests the work was relational, personal, built from thousands of individual human connections, tribe by tribe, person by person, culture by culture. A name that suggests the cost of the mission was measured not in battles but in relationships, in years spent inside a world that was trying, in Sauron's name, to reshape everything it touched. Picture this. The Second Age is at its height. Sauron, not yet defeated, not yet humbled, still in command of his full power and his physical form, is moving through the East like a theology, not a conqueror. He is not always arriving with armies. He is arriving with answers. He has a story about the world that explains everything, that promises order and meaning to peoples who have lived in the shadow of death and chaos since the First Age, since the days when Morgoth himself walked Middle-earth and broke things that were never entirely repaired. Sauron is offering those peoples a framework, a religion, a set of rituals that give form to fear and make submission feel like devotion. And into that world, 2 Maiar arrive. They do not have armies. They cannot use their full power. That is the condition of the wizard's mission, the divine restriction that makes them vulnerable in exactly the ways mortals are vulnerable, subject to weariness, to doubt, to the slow erosion of certainty. They arrive with the names they have been given, the work they have been assigned, and 3,000 years of field ahead of them. What would it take to operate inside that? What would it cost, not after a decade or a century, but after a millennium, to maintain the clarity of the original purpose? To remember, through year after year of living inside a world Sauron-shaped, that you are there to dismantle it and not to adapt to it. This is the question the Blue Wizard's story carries at its center, not whether they succeeded in military terms, but whether they survived in the deeper sense, whether the entity that walked into the East in the Second Age was still recognizably itself by the Third Age's end. We will return to that question. But first, we need to understand the full architecture of what they were working against. Because Sauron's hold on the East was not just political. It was not just an army of Easterlings who happened to be hostile to the West. It was something much older and much more structurally embedded than that. And understanding it is what makes the Blue Wizard's mission genuinely terrifying rather than merely difficult. Go back to the Silmarillion, go to Valaquenta and Ainulin Dal, then follow the thread forward through the Second Age chapters. What you find is that the theology Sauron was building in the East was not something he invented from scratch. He inherited it. He was refining and redeploying a corruption that had existed since Morgoth walked the world, since the First Age, when the enemy himself moved among men and elves and shaped their understanding of existence toward despair and submission. This is what Tolkien describes in the later lore concerning the East, in the passages that appear in unfinished tales around the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. Sauron, after Morgoth's defeat, did not abandon the theological project. He systematized it. He took the fear and the shadow that Morgoth had planted in human hearts and built institutions around it. Not just slavery, not just conquest, actual religious architecture, doctrine, ritual, myth. The peoples of the East were not merely under military occupation. They had been given a story about the world that made Sauron's supremacy feel like the natural order of things. And here is what that actually means for two Maiar walking into that world. It means that the Blue Wizards were not arriving as military advisors or political organizers in any conventional sense. They were arriving as the countervoice to a theology. They needed to give people not just a reason to resist Sauron's armies, but a reason to doubt Sauron's account of reality. That is an entirely different kind of warfare. It operates on timescales that make physical battles look brief. It requires the kind of intimate, sustained, culturally embedded presence that puts every possible pressure on the agent conducting it. Tolkien, in Letter 156, describes the wizard's mission in terms of inspiring resistance and hope rather than direct combat. The restriction on their power was intentional, part of the design. They were not supposed to overwhelm Sauron by force. They were supposed to kindle something in the free peoples of Middle-earth, some ember of independent will that would allow those peoples to resist Sauron themselves. That is an extraordinary thing to attempt in the West, where the elves still held their rings, where Rivendell stood as a visible counterweight to Mordor's shadow, where the memory of the Last Alliance was living history in the minds of people who had participated in it. Imagine attempting it in the East, where the Last Alliance was not a memory of shared victory, but, from many of those people's perspectives, an invasion by the kings of the West, where the elves were remote or hostile, or simply absent, where there was no Rivendell, no Círdan, no Galadriel, no ancient community that had existed since the Elder Days as a physical embodiment of the world's resistance to darkness. The Blue Wizards walked into a world where Sauron had no visible opposition, where his account of reality went largely unchallenged, because the only voices that might have challenged it were thousands of miles away and barely aware that these people existed. They were starting from zero. 3,000 years of starting from zero. Now think about what Tolkien actually says in Letter 211 with that admission, that he feared the Blue Wizards may have had something to do with the beginnings of magical cults and secret religions. Because here is what that fear actually implies. Here is the architecture of the concern. The Valar sent the wizards specifically to inspire resistance through natural means, not through power display, not through coercion, through influence, through relationship, through being inside the cultures they were trying to help, being present, being trusted, being woven into the social fabric of the peoples they were working among. But once you are woven into a culture's social fabric, once you have been there long enough, that people do not remember a time before you, the line between guide and founder becomes genuinely difficult to locate. The Blue Wizards, working across generations of mortal men who lived and died while the Maiar remained, would have accumulated a kind of presence that is almost impossible to keep entirely clean of veneration. People remember the figure who was there when their grandfather's grandfather was a child. They build stories around that figure. They build practices around those stories. And if the figure is trying, in Tolkien's cosmological framework, to teach people to resist a theology of submission to a dark lord, to give them a framework of spiritual autonomy, a sense that they have worth and will that Sauron cannot own, then that figure is, functionally, founding a counter-theology, which is, structurally, a cult, or a religion, depending on how it develops. This is not corruption in the obvious sense. It is not Saruman hoarding rings and betraying allies. It is something subtler, and in some ways, harder to judge. It is the possibility that the Blue Wizards succeeded at their mission so thoroughly that they became the thing they were helping, which is not what the Valar sent them to do, because the Valar's whole point was that the resistance needed to come from within the peoples themselves, not from dependence on a powerful outside figure. But here is the thing nobody asks. What was the alternative? Go into the East, refuse to become embedded in the cultures there, maintain careful divine distance, and watch Sauron's theology consume every person you were sent to help, because the careful distance meant you never actually helped them enough to matter. The Blue Wizards were placed in an impossible position, not because the Valar were careless, but because the problem they were sent to solve was actually that hard, and Tolkien knew it. Which is why Letter 211 does not accuse them. It worries about them. There is a difference. Accusation would be clean. Worry is the response to a situation where someone you sent into danger may or may not have come through it, and you cannot quite tell from the outside. And this is where Gandalf enters the frame. Because here is the thing the lore has been quietly building toward this entire time. Tolkien, in the Astari chapter of Unfinished Tales, describes the arrival of all 5 wizards at the Grey Havens. Together, all 5. They came from Valinor together, sent under the same divine mandate, under Manwë's authority, as a coordinated response to Sauron's continued threat. They had, before their arrival, been briefed by the same Valar. They understood the same strategic picture. They knew each other in Valinor, knew each other as Maiar who had dwelt in the presence of the same powers across ages of the world. And then they parted. Gandalf went west, into Eriador, toward the elves and the remnants of the Númenórean kingdoms. The Blue Wizards went east, into Sauron's territory, into the theological occupation. Saruman, eventually, settled in Isengard. Radagast stayed near nature, near birds and beasts, near Roscobel. But they all knew each other, they all had the same origin, and Gandalf, more than any of the others, was the one described explicitly as the most strategically engaged, the most connected to the network of resistance across Middle-earth. His connections included Círdan, the Eagles, the Rangers of the North, Galadriel and Celeborn, the Dwarves of Erebor, the Hobbits of the Shire, the Men of Rohan. He was not sitting in Rivendell thinking. He was moving, constantly, for 2,000 years of the Third Age, gathering intelligence, watching for Sauron's movements, tracing the shadow wherever it fell. Do you honestly believe he never tried to find out what was happening in the East? That question is not rhetorical decoration. It is the structural center of what the silence in the lore is actually telling us. Because the absence of any documented contact between Gandalf and the Blue Wizards across the entire Third Age, the complete silence on the subject in every text Tolkien wrote, is not the same as evidence that no contact occurred. It is evidence that if contact occurred, it was not something the Western record preserved. Which, given that all of Western Middle-earth's memory is the record we have access to, and given that the Blue Wizards were operating in territory so far removed from that record that entire civilizations could rise and fall there without the elves of Rivendell knowing, tells us very little. What it does tell us is what kind of contact might have been possible, and this is where the lore layers compound each other into something genuinely strange and moving. Go to Appendix B. Look at the chronology of the Third Age, with the Blue Wizard's mission as a background hum. What you see, when you map Sauron's movements against what the Blue Wizards were doing, is a striking strategic gap. Sauron, throughout the Third Age, drew his forces from the east, the Easterlings, the Haradrim, the Variags of Khand. These were real military forces that repeatedly threatened the Free Peoples. They showed up at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. They showed up at every major conflict where Sauron pushed westward, but they never showed up in full force. Sauron had allies across an enormous swathe of the world's eastern population. He had spent the Second Age building exactly the kind of theological and political infrastructure that should have allowed him to mobilize an eastern host so vast it would have overwhelmed anything Gondor or Rohan, or even the combined forces of the West, could have resisted. The Pelennor Fields was terrifying, but it was not the entirety of what Sauron commanded. If he had been able to fully mobilize the East, the Fellowship's victory becomes much harder to imagine. Why didn't he? There are military answers you could offer: distance, supply lines, the difficulty of coordinating vast armies. These are real factors. But the lore offers a different answer, and Tolkien offers it in the most direct language he ever uses about the Blue Wizards. They weakened and disorganized the forces of the East. 3,000 years of work. 3,000 years of pulling at the threads of Sauron's eastern networks, seeding doubt in the theology, building relationships with peoples who had been told they had no choice, kindling that ember Tolkien talked about in Letter 156, the ember of independent will, the sense that submission to Sauron was not the natural order of things, but a specific choice that could be refused. And here is the result. When Sauron needed his Eastern Empire to mobilize completely, it did not. Some came, too many, but not all. Not the full weight of what the East represented in terms of population and military potential. Picture this. Somewhere in the Third Age, maybe in the early centuries, maybe later, Gandalf is traveling, not through the Shire, not through Eriador, east, past the misty mountains, past Rhûn, past the places that have names on maps, and into the places that do not. Because something is wrong. Some intelligence has reached him, through the birds, through one of the ranger networks, through a dream message carried in the way Maiar can sometimes carry knowledge to each other, that suggests the Blue Wizard's situation has become unstable, or has become silent in a way that silence should not be. And he finds one of them, Morinitar, or Romestamo, standing in a place that feels wrong in the way places feel wrong, when the shadow has been present for a very long time, wearing clothes that have absorbed the colors of Eastern civilization, speaking in languages Gandalf barely recognizes, surrounded by people who look at this figure with a reverence that is, on the surface, indistinguishable from the reverence Sauron's followers show to Sauron. And Gandalf has to decide, in that moment, whether he is looking at a Maiar who has stayed faithful and simply adapted deeply to a necessary role, or at a Maiar who has forgotten what the role was for. What does that conversation sound like? What do you say to someone who has been alone in enemy territory for 1,000 years, doing work that nobody back home can verify or fully understand, surrounded by people whose entire framework of reality has been shaped by the enemy you are both fighting, when you are not certain whether the person in front of you is still the person who left Valinor? That conversation, the one the texts do not record, may be the most important conversation in the entire history of the Third Age. Because if Gandalf had that conversation and found something intact in the Blue Wizards, something still oriented toward the original mission, then the War of the Ring was won by 5 agents working across 2 different theaters, not 3. The victory at Mount Doom was the visible tip of a much larger and much longer campaign. And if Gandalf had that conversation and found something else, something that had drifted, that had become the thing it was fighting, that had built not just influence but dependency, not just resistance but a rival theology, then the Age of Men began with a wound in it that nobody in the West knows about. A darkness in the East that does not wear Sauron's face. Something that grew in the space where the blue wizards operated, nourished by years of sincere effort that eventually curved towards something neither the Valar nor the wizards intended. Tolkien does not tell us which of those possibilities is the truth. I do not think that silence is accidental. Let us go deeper into what the Second Age context actually looks like for the blue wizards, because the lore layers here compound in a way that has direct consequences for understanding what 3,000 years of their work would have actually involved. The Silmarillion establishes that Sauron's move into the East was not a retreat after his defeat at the War of the Elves, and Sauron, the conflict in the Second Age when Gil-galad and the Númenóreans drove him back. It was a strategic withdrawal to a theater where his losses had been lower and his investments deeper. The men of the East had been in Morgoth's shadow before Sauron was anything more than Morgoth's lieutenant. The darkness there was older than Sauron's specific ambitions, rooted in the First Age corruption that Morgoth had spread through his presence alone. What this means is that the blue wizards were not just fighting Sauron's recent work in the East. They were fighting accumulated theological sediment going back to the beginning of the world's history with evil. Every lie Morgoth had told about the nature of elves and men and the Valar. Every framework of meaning that had been built around submission and fear across thousands of years before either Sauron or the blue wizards arrived. This is the context that makes Tolkien's worry in Letter 211 feel genuinely compassionate rather than accusatory. He is not saying the blue wizards were weak or faithless. He is saying that the thing they were sent to fight was not something that could be fought cleanly in a finite time. It was a spiritual environment, a way of seeing the world that had been shaped across ages by the greatest evil to ever exist. And the only way to work inside it was to be inside it, fully, which is exactly the condition that makes any corrupting influence most dangerous. The Maiar who became Balrogs did not wake up one morning and decide to serve Morgoth. They were in his presence. His music was in the air around them. His vision of the world was compelling to the parts of their nature that resonated with power and fire. They were not foolish or lazy. They were, over time, in the wrong environment, and the environment eventually won. The blue wizards were placing themselves in an analogous environment by design, because there was no other way to do the work. And here is where the mechanics of the wizard's nature become crucial to understanding what was at stake. The Ainur are not human spirits. They are not susceptible to corruption in the same immediate sense. But Tolkien is very precise about what happens when a Maiar takes physical form and operates under the restrictions the wizards accepted. From the Astari and from the broader cosmological framework of Ainulin Dal, we know that the wizards were sent in a restricted form, specifically because the unrestricted use of Maiar power would displace, rather than kindle, the free will of the peoples they were helping. They were made dependent on mortal conditions, in ways that real physical beings are dependent. They could feel weariness. They could experience doubt. They could be worn down. Saruman's corruption is the most visible example of what this vulnerability looks like when it goes wrong. He did not fall in a single moment. He fell across years of isolation in Orthanc, of spending too much time with his Palantir, of having a vision of order and efficiency that gradually separated itself from the original purpose it was supposed to serve. The power he had was real. His intelligence was real. His organizational skill was real. But all of that, in isolation, without the corrective influence of constant contact with the peoples and purposes he was supposed to serve, bent toward himself. Now ask yourself what two Maiar, operating in an even more isolated environment, with even less corrective contact with the Western network of resistance, surrounded by populations whose entire framework of reality had been shaped by the enemy, would face across a period 3 times longer than the entire Third Age. Saruman fell. He had Rivendell to visit. He had Galadriel to correspond with. He had the White Council. He had the full context of Western resistance visible to him at regular intervals. The Blue Wizards had none of that, which makes what Tolkien says in Letter 211 sound less like an accusation and more like a miracle. He believed, with what he describes as real uncertainty, that they had had a very great influence in weakening Sauron's eastern forces. He gives them credit, that is, given the conditions they were operating in, almost impossibly large. And then he worries, because the great influence and the magical cults are not necessarily two different outcomes. They might be the same outcome, looked at from different angles. You can weaken Sauron's hold on the East by building something that competes with Sauron's theology. And what you build in that competition will carry your mark, will require your continued presence to maintain, will, over generations, become something that looks to the people practicing it less like inspired autonomous resistance and more like devotion to a new set of figures who replaced the old ones. This is the knife's edge the blue wizards were walking. And now we need to talk about what the lore says, indirectly but unmistakably, about whether that knife's edge was ever navigated successfully. Go back to Appendix B. Go to the timeline of the War of the Ring. Follow the Eastern Front. Sauron's eastern allies fought at the Pelennor. A significant eastern force moved against the lands of Gondor and Rohan during the war. These are documented events. The Easterlings were real military actors in the final conflict. But here is the number that matters. Gondor won, the West held, not easily, and not without Frodo and Sam doing something in Mordor that nobody else could do, but the military theater in the West was held. If Sauron had been able to fully mobilize the East, that does not happen. The forces at the Pelennor were vast. If they had been 3 times larger, if every Eastern people who had been under Sauron's influence for millennia had marched in full loyalty to his banner, the Rohirrim's charge and the armies of the dead and Aragorn's flanking force would not have been enough. The mathematics of the military situation make this almost self-evident. Something kept the East from fully mobilizing, and the only canonical answer Tolkien gives is the Blue Wizards. 3,000 years of quiet, documented, admitted strategic disruption. 3,000 years of weakening and disorganizing, meaning that when Sauron called, the Eastern networks did not answer at full strength because the networks had been compromised, because there were peoples in the East who had been given a different story about the world, who had been helped by 2 figures whose names most fans cannot remember, to think of themselves as something other than Sauron's instruments. The Fellowship did not win the War of the Ring alone. They won it at the end of a 3,000-year campaign that they inherited, that they never knew they were inheriting, conducted in a theater they never visited, by 2 agents they likely never fully understood. That is the lore. That is what Tolkien actually wrote, and the weight of it is extraordinary once you stop treating the Blue Wizards as an afterthought. But now we arrive at the part of this that does not resolve cleanly, the part that Tolkien himself could not resolve, and I think refused to resolve, because the refusal is part of the point. What happened to Morinitar and Romistamo? The texts give us nothing after their arrival and their departure east. Nothing. Not in the main text of The Lord of the Rings, not in the appendices, which trace Gandalf and Saruman and Radagast and the movements of elves and men and dwarves across the full length of the Third Age. Not in unfinished tales beyond the initial identification. Not in the letters beyond that single paragraph in letter 211. Not in any of the drafts that Christopher Tolkien assembled in the history of Middle-earth. They walk east, and the record stops. Now think about what Tolkien chose to record and what he chose not to record. The appendices are extraordinarily detailed. They track individual rangers and their deaths. They note the birth years of hobbits. They document the exact chronology of every major event across thousands of years. The record exists because someone, the tradition of the Red Book, the scholars of the Fourth Age, believed this information mattered and preserved it. The Blue Wizards are not in that record after their departure east. This is not because they were unimportant. We have established that they were, by Tolkien's own admission, critically important. The absence is not carelessness. It is a specific kind of silence. In Tolkien's world, the absence of a record is itself meaningful. The Entwives disappeared. The record stops. Their absence becomes a specific grief that the Ents carry across the entire Third Age, a wound that is felt precisely because there is no answer to it. The Blue Wizard's silence may be the same kind of wound, not accidental, not a loose end, a deliberate refusal to close a question that should remain open, because what the question asks is too large to answer, and answering it would reduce something that should remain vast. Which brings us to the question that lives at the center of all of this. We asked it at the beginning, but we know more now. The question hits differently here. Did the Blue Wizards succeed? Not in the limited sense of whether they weakened Sauron's eastern forces, because Tolkien tells us they did, or at least he believed they did, as much as he could tell from the outside. But in the deeper sense, the sense that matters if you have followed everything this lore is actually saying. Did Morinitar and Romastamo remain themselves? Did the two Maiar who sailed from Valinor, who were briefed by the same powers who briefed Gandalf, who walked east into the most theologically hostile environment in the history of the world, with names that meant Darkness Slayer and East Helper, still carry those names in their hearts after 3,000 years? Or did the darkness they were slaying find a way inside? Or is the answer something stranger and less binary than either of those options? Something that Tolkien hinted at with that worried sentence in Letter 211, something that is not success or failure but a third thing. A Maiar who fought for so long inside a corrupted world that the fighting itself changed them, that they became something the Valar did not send but also something the Valar could not have managed without? Picture this. The War of the Ring is over. The ring is destroyed. Sauron is unmade. The Third Age ends. The elves depart. Gandalf sails. Círdan stands at the havens and watches the last of the great powers leave the world. And somewhere in the east, in a place the maps do not name, two figures are still there. Not because they are trapped, not because the path to the havens is closed to them, but because the work is not finished, because the peoples they have been working with for 3,000 years are still there, because the theological wounds Sauron left in the east are not healed just because Sauron is gone. Because the magical cults, if that is what they are, and the secret religions, if that is what they have become, are still there, growing or contracting around the presence of two beings who have been in the field so long they may not remember what Valinor feels like from the inside. Do they ever leave? Does anyone come for them? Does Gandalf, standing on the ship that is carrying him home, think about the two who are not there? Does he know whether they are still themselves? I think he does not know. I think this is precisely what Tolkien knew and refused to resolve, because the resolution would require a judgment about whether the Blue Wizards succeeded in the deepest sense, and that judgment is not his to make, and not ours, and maybe not even the Valar's. Because what the Blue Wizards were attempting was not something that has a clean criterion for success. They were trying to help people who had been shaped by darkness choose something else. The result of that help cannot be assessed in a single generation, cannot be assessed in 3 ages. The peoples of the East are still there when the 4th age begins. What they carry, what beliefs and practices and half-remembered stories about two figures who were there for as long as anyone can remember, is still shaping the world. Whether it shapes it toward freedom or toward a new kind of dependency is a question the lore leaves open. And maybe that is the actual shape of the Blue Wizard's legacy, not the dramatic arc of Gandalf, who fell and rose and sailed home in triumph, not the dramatic fall of Saruman, who chose himself over his mission and ended as a small and bitter ghost. Something different. Something that does not fit either template. A mission that was conducted so deeply inside the problem that it could not be cleanly extracted from it. A victory that left scars that look like victories and scars that look like wounds, and no reliable way to tell which is which from the outside. Let us talk about Gandalf one more time, because Gandalf's relationship to the Blue Wizards is not just a question of whether they met or coordinated. It is a question of what Gandalf knew and what he did with that knowledge. Gandalf was, in Tolkien's words, the wisest of the Maiar, He was chosen specifically because of his compassion and his subtlety. Because he was the one most likely to understand the peoples he was working with, and least likely to be seduced by power. Narya, the Ring of Fire, the Ring of Kindling, was given to him by Círdan precisely because those qualities would be needed most, because the work ahead would require inspiring hope in the darkest moments. Gandalf was also, through his entire presence in Middle-earth, paying attention. He is the one who tracked the necromancer in Dol Guldur for decades before the White Council acted. He is the one who identified the ring from half-remembered lore and a conversation with Bilbo. He is the one who found Thorin Oakenshield in the prancing pony and saw, in the map of a dead king, a thread that led to a dragon and an ancient wound in the north that needed to be healed before Sauron could use it. He paid attention to everything. It was his nature and his function. Do you believe he did not pay attention to the East? Here is what the lore actually confirms. In the Istari, Tolkien notes that LOTR was the one who went to the East most deeply, and that Pallando followed him as his friend. This is an interesting detail on its own, the idea that one of the blue wizards went into the East primarily out of loyalty to the other, not just out of divine mandate. It suggests a personal texture to their relationship, a human-like dimension of companionship that is at once touching and, in the context of 3,000 years of isolation, slightly terrifying. Two Maiar who stayed together in the East because they had each other. What happens to the judgment of two beings who are each other's primary reference point for 3,000 years, with no external corrective beyond occasional contact with the peoples they were helping? This detail makes the blue wizards feel less like divine agents and more like something achingly fragile. They were not invulnerable. They were not armored by their divine nature against the slow corrosions of time and isolation. They had each other, and the peoples they worked with, and the purpose they were sent to serve. Whether those three things were enough across 3,000 years is the question. And Gandalf, who knew them before they left, who stood with them at the Grey Havens when they first arrived, who understood the nature of the Istari mission and the vulnerabilities it entailed. Gandalf would have been the person most likely, in all of Middle-earth, to understand what the blue wizards were facing in the East, because he was facing the same vulnerabilities in a less extreme version in the West. The difference between Gandalf and the blue wizards is, in some ways, a difference of environment rather than character. Gandalf had the Shire, he had Rivendell, he had Galadriel, he had regular reminders, in the faces of the people he loved, of what he was working to protect. The blue wizards had a world shaped entirely by the enemy they were fighting. If Gandalf ever found a way to contact them, to send word, to receive word, the content of that communication would be among the most important intelligence in the entire Third Age. Not just military intelligence, though that mattered enormously. But the deeper question, are you still there? Are you still yourselves? Do you still know what you are fighting for? And if the answer came back wrong, or did not come back at all, what did Gandalf do with that? Because here is a thought that the lore supports without confirming. Gandalf's urgency in the Third Age, his willingness to push against the White Council's caution, his insistence on engaging with the necromancer in Dol Guldur earlier rather than later, his discomfort with delay and compromise. These qualities are often read as simply characteristic of his nature. The wisest and most compassionate, yes, but also the most restless, the most aware of how little time the Free Peoples actually had. What if some of that urgency was informed by what he knew, or feared, about the East? What if Gandalf's sense that the Third Age was running out of time was not just based on Sauron's movements in Dol Guldur and the search for the ring, but also on some knowledge of what was happening east of the maps? Some indication that the Blue Wizard's work was in jeopardy, or had already reached some kind of crisis, and that the window for victory in the West was narrowing, not because Sauron was getting stronger, but because the Eastern theater that had been containing his full force was getting less reliable. This is speculation, clearly, but it is speculation that stays within Tolkien's established cosmological logic. The 5 wizards were sent as a coordinated response. Their missions were not independent. They were 5 elements of a single strategy. It follows that the state of any one element would affect the others, that Gandalf, as the most strategically engaged of the remaining faithful wizards, would not have been indifferent to the state of the element operating in the most critical theater. And now here is the layer that compounds all of this into something genuinely philosophical. If the blue wizards did partially fall, if they did found magical cults, if they did become figures of veneration in ways the Valar did not intend, then the peoples of the East in the Fourth Age are carrying a damaged legacy. Not Sauron's legacy, or at least not only Sauron's legacy, but something in between. A spiritual inheritance that was shaped by beings of genuine good intent who, over 3,000 years, could not entirely prevent the shape of their presence from becoming a new kind of dependency. And the peoples of the East, in the Fourth Age, are the people who will have to build the world forward from that inheritance. They did not choose it. They received it. The way the men of the West received the complicated legacy of Númenor, the pride and the gift and the fall. The way the elves received the legacy of the kinslaying, which followed them across every age they lived in and shaped their choices in ways they could not always fully see. The blue wizards, whether they succeeded or failed or became something in between, left the East something, not a map, not a kingdom, not a clear tradition of resistance with clean founding documents, something messier and more human and more real than that. A half-remembered theology, a set of practices that carry the trace of a divine intention in a form that has been shaped by 3,000 years of mortal hands. Whether that is enough to build a Fourth Age worth living in is the question the lore never answers, and the question that makes the Blue Wizard's story the most haunting, unresolved thread in all of Tolkien's world. Picture this. The Fourth Age is beginning. Aragorn is king. The Shire is being replanted. The elves are sailing. The world is entering the Age of Men, which is what the whole history of Arda was moving toward, the age when the children of Ilúvatar take full responsibility for the world's keeping. East of the maps, in territories that are not yet part of any kingdom Aragorn will ever rule, peoples are living according to practices and beliefs that carry the fingerprints of 2 Maiar, who are either gone or still there, still present or long transformed. The men and women of those peoples do not know the name Olorin, do not know the name Narya, do not know the story of Frodo and the Ring, at least not yet, not in any form they would recognize. They know whatever Morinitar and Romestamo left them. And whether what was left was a gift or a wound, or whether it was both, the way the greatest gifts in Tolkien's world tend to also be wounds, is a question that cannot be resolved from the Western record. We know the West's story. We have it in extraordinary detail, from the music of the Ainur to the departure from the Grey Havens. The lore is vast and deep, and heartbreakingly specific about the Western theater. The Eastern story is a silence. And here is the thing about silences in Tolkien's world. They are never empty. The Entwive's silence is full of longing. The silence about Glorfindel's intermediate age between his death in the First Age and his return in the Third is full of the mechanics of Mandos and rebirth. The silence about what happened to the Eagles after the Third Age is full of the implied grief of a world that is slowly losing its most extraordinary creatures. The silence about the Blue Wizards is full of 3,000 years of work that the world depended on and does not remember, full of 2 Maiar who walked east and may or may not have walked back, full of the question of whether the eastern peoples of Middle-earth were saved or were simply given a different kind of shaping, and whether the difference matters, or whether all shaping, even the most loving and well-intentioned shaping, is its own kind of weight on the free peoples who carry it forward. Tolkien wrote in his letters that he believed the Blue Wizards had very great influence. He wrote that belief with what reads, to me, as the hope of a creator who wanted his agents to have been faithful, who wanted the 2 who went east without the network, without the support, without the Shire and the elves and the memory of the last alliance, to have stayed true to what they were sent to do. But he also wrote his worry. And the worry is part of the canon, not just the hope. Both are there. Both have to be held simultaneously, because that is what the lore actually says when you follow it all the way down. Let me bring this to the place it has been building toward from the very beginning of this conversation. The War of the Ring, as most of us understand it, is a story about the Fellowship, about Frodo and Sam, about Gandalf's sacrifice and return, about Aragorn becoming who he was always meant to be, about the Shire, which is small and beloved and worth protecting, standing as the symbol of everything that the darkness threatens and everything that the light is trying to preserve. That is a true story, and it is a beautiful one. But it is not the whole story. The whole story includes two Maiar who sailed from Valinor before most of the events of the Third Age even began, who received their names, Darkness Slayer, East Helper, and understood that the names were a mission statement, who walked into a world that had been shaped by Morgoth's theology and then refined by Sauron's, a world where the accumulated spiritual damage went back to the earliest ages of the children of Ilúvatar, who had each other because they were friends, or something like friends, the way Maiar can be friends, which is a form of loyalty that is older than any mortal concept of friendship, and who worked for 3,000 years in a theater that the Western record does not preserve to do what Tolkien said they did, weaken and disorganize the forces of the East. Without them, the Pelennor falls. The logic is almost cold. Without the 3,000 years of disruption in the East, Sauron's eastern networks mobilize fully, and no amount of Aragorn's strategic genius, or Theoden's courage, or the army of the dead changes the arithmetic of the battle. The Blue Wizards made the War of the Ring winnable. They made it possible to even have a fellowship, to even attempt the one plan that might work, the long-shot suicidal mercy of carrying the ring to the fire, because the military situation in the West was stable enough, barely, to keep Sauron's gaze occupied long enough for Frodo to do the impossible. All of that happened because two wizards nobody remembers did 3,000 years of work in a place nobody remembers. And the question of whether they remained themselves through that work is not just a question about them. It is a question about the nature of the mission itself. It is Tolkien asking whether it is possible to fight a theology from the inside without becoming, in some way, part of what you are fighting. Whether the most intimate kind of resistance, the kind that requires you to be fully present inside the world you are trying to change, can be conducted without leaving some part of yourself in the shape of the world you have been pressing against for 3,000 years. This question is not unique to Tolkien's world. It is the question of every person who has spent their life working to change something deeply wrong in the world around them, and who has looked up after decades of that work and wondered whether the work had changed them more than they had changed the work, whether the long exposure to the thing they were fighting had taken something from them they did not know they were giving. Tolkien does not resolve this question for Morinitar and Romestamo. I do not think he could. I think he understood, by the time he was writing Letter 211, that the answer was not resolvable from outside the experience, that only the Blue Wizards themselves could know whether they had stayed themselves, and that even they might not be certain. What he gives us instead is the worry, the hope that they had very great influence, the fear that they may have become something else. Both things held open, both things honored. Neither one collapsed into a clean verdict. And in a way, that refusal to resolve it is the most Tolkien thing he ever did with these two, because the whole of his legendarium is built on the principle that the most important things are often the ones that cannot be cleanly judged. The kinslaying was terrible, and was also the act that eventually placed the Silmaril in the sky, as a star that gave Frodo hope in the darkest moment of the War of the Ring. Boromir's reaching for the ring was a betrayal, and was also the act that sent Frodo to Mordor without the Fellowship. The great moral questions of Tolkien's world do not resolve into simple verdicts. They resolve into understanding, which is different, which is the recognition that the same action can be both faithful and failed, both a gift and a wound, depending on how far forward you trace its consequences. The Blue Wizards are the largest expression of that principle in the entire legendarium, two agents whose work was cosmologically necessary and whose methods were cosmologically dangerous, whose success depended on them becoming deeply embedded in the very thing they were fighting, whose faithfulness or unfaithfulness, or something in between, shaped the world in ways that the Western record cannot see and that the Eastern record does not preserve. We end where we began, but the question is different now. At the start of this, I asked whether two wizards you have never heard of might have made the victory at Mount Doom possible. The answer is yes. Tolkien says so. The lore makes it structurally necessary. The Blue Wizards' 3,000 years of work is the foundation beneath the War of the Rings victory, the thing that made the final sprint to Mordor possible, because the gates were not yet fully closed by an Eastern force that should have overwhelmed the West entirely. But the question that matters now, the one that has been building across everything we have been through together, is different. What does it mean that the agents who made that foundation possible cannot be clearly accounted for? That their creator feared for them without being able to condemn them? That they operated in a silence so complete that the world they saved does not have a record of their names, and that the names it does have, Morinitar, Romestamo, Darkness Slayer, East Helper, were given to them before they knew how long the darkness would be, before they knew how much the East would need helping, before they knew that the help would take so long it might take them with it. The Age of Men begins. Aragorn rules. The Shire recovers. Legolas and Gimli remain as a last bridge between the elder races and the new age. The world moves forward into the time when the great powers are gone, and men are responsible for their own keeping. In the East, something continues. A practice, a story, a half-remembered tradition built around figures who were there for as long as anyone can remember. Whether those figures are still there, still themselves, still watching what they built and asking whether it has held the shape they intended, or whether they have become the stories, absorbed into the mythologies they helped create, is a question that the Fourth Age inherits without inheriting the answer. This is Tolkien at his deepest. Not the triumph of the Fellowship, which is real and earned and genuinely moving, but the unresolved question underneath it, the wound that victory does not close. The two who went east and are not counted among the returnees because there is no record of whether they returned, because the East does not have a Grey Havens, does not have a ship waiting, does not have a Círdan to stand at the shore and watch for who comes back. Did Morinitar and Romestamo succeed? Did they remain themselves? Did they become what they were sent to extinguish? Or something stranger, something the Valar's plan had not fully anticipated? A Maya shaped by 3,000 years of intimate contact with the peoples they were helping, no longer quite the being that sailed from Valinor but not quite lost either. Something in between that Middle-earth has no name for. The lore does not answer. And I think that silence, that specific, deliberate, aching silence at the eastern edge of the world's story is exactly how Tolkien wanted it. Because the question of whether you can fight the darkness from the inside without becoming part of it is the question every age has to answer for itself. The Blue Wizards answered it in a way that nobody fully witnessed. The peoples of the East are carrying whatever that answer was forward into a world that has moved on and forgotten to ask. And maybe that is its own kind of answer. Not the one we wanted, not the triumph or the fall, but the persistence. The fact that something of the original intention survived 3,000 years of pressure and loneliness and proximity to the worst thing the world had ever produced and became, in the end, not a monument or a legend, but a living thread in the fabric of peoples who are still there, still making choices, still shaping the world forward. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what Romestamo means. East Helper. Not East Savior, not East Conqueror. East Helper. Someone who was there, who stayed, who helped, whose help was real and consequential and impure and enormous, all at once. Whatever they became, whatever Tolkien feared and hoped for them simultaneously, The Eastern peoples entered the Fourth Age with something they would not have had without two Maiar who walked into the world's longest darkness and chose to stay. I cannot tell you that was worth what it cost. I cannot tell you it was not. If the Blue Wizard's story has made you feel something you did not expect to feel when you started this video, something heavier than lore satisfaction, something closer to grief or awe, or the specific discomfort of a question that cannot be answered cleanly, then the lore has done what Tolkien designed it to do. He built his world to be the kind of place where the most important truths are the ones that resist resolution, where the right question, asked seriously enough, opens rather than closes. Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Not whether you think the Blue Wizards fell or stayed faithful, though I want to know that too. I want to know whether the silence itself means something to you, whether the eastern edge of Middle-earth feels different to you now than it did before, whether two names, Morinitar and Romestamo, sit differently in your mind, knowing what they were up against for 3,000 years and what they may have carried through it. This is the kind of lore that deserves to be talked about, not as trivia, as the genuine philosophical architecture of a world that is still, in the right hands and the right reading, astonishingly alive. If you want to keep going deeper into the corners of the legendarium that the films could never quite reach, the channel is here. The lore does not run out, and neither does the darkness, or the light that keeps choosing to walk into it.